Good evening, chaps. It's so good to be back here with you. It's deep in November, and usually I would say on Saturday, go and party. On Saturday, Sunday, reserve that day for worship, and at night, go to bed, give yourself a good cup of hot chocolate, and read some Victorian literature. Go and read Holmes and Dr. Watson, or Dr. Jekyll and Hyde. But tonight we have our own iconic Victorian duo. They're two very special guests, two very highly esteemed authors. We've got Margaret Stetz, the Professor of Women's Studies and Professor of Humanities at the University of Delaware. She's the author of more than 130 published essays and chapters in various scholarly journals on really a wide array of subjects. And she's also curated at least 7 exhibitions on turn of the century art, literature, and book history. A very impressive track record. Then we have her colleague, Mark Samuels Lasner, who's a senior research fellow at the Library of the University of Delaware. He's one of the leading authorities on the literature and art of the late Victorian era. And he's the world's foremost Maximaniac, to use a term he himself coined. He has the world's largest private collection of works and items related to the artist and caricaturist and writer Max Beerbohm, although he has now donated most of his collection to his university. It's so good to be here with you.
Oh, it's lovely to
Thank
be
you.
with you. Thank you very much.
So last year you organized, both of you, an engaging exhibition on the art of Aubrey Beardsley,
Yes.
the young prodigy who died aged 25 of tuberculosis, of consumption, who was a good friend of Oscar Wilde. And this year, you are dedicating another exhibition on a friend of theirs, and a rival. That's Max Beerbohm, and it's his first major exhibition in nearly 50 years. So this is very exciting. It's called The Price of Celebrity. It's on at the New York Public Library. Now, everyone, you can post your questions in the chat as always, and we'll be answering throughout the show. My first question to both of you is, if you had to convince an open-minded person with, however, no prior knowledge of or interest in late Victorian and early 20th century art or literature to see the exhibition, what would you say to them?
Well, you've just described my teaching, because whenever I teach almost anything, I am faced with people who don't know a thing about what they're encountering. And I have to try to persuade them that this is something worth knowing, whatever it is. So that very question occurred to both of us, and it shaped how we are presenting this exhibition. We've tried, and Mark will tell you more about this, we've tried for several years to have Beerbohm exhibitions in a number of different venues. And somehow that never worked out. But the idea for the exhibition went through several iterations. And we thought at one point of doing something about Max Beerbohm and the theater, because he was a theater critic for 12 years, working at the Saturday Review. And he did lots of caricatures of theatrical celebrities. Then we thought of having a sort of general survey of his career that would be called Max Beerbohm, Master of Celebrity Caricature. And I began thinking about my undergraduates, whom I love, but who don't know the first thing about the first thing, and who are not even terribly familiar with the word caricature or tremendously interested in that word. So that dropped out, and we began thinking, well, what would get someone to walk into this exhibition in the New York Public Library? What is it that people are interested in right now if they are not interested in Beerbohm, if the name Beerbohm means nothing to them? It's the word celebrity. And of course, Max Beerbohm caricatured celebrities, but he was also very much aware of the danger of celebrity, the kind of risks that a celebrity culture posed. And there he was on the cusp of the celebrity industry writing about this, drawing things related to this. And so we came up with the focus, with the narrative, centered on this subtitle, The Price of Celebrity. And we would say that anyone who is interested in how people in the past thought about celebrity, why they were skeptical of this emphasis on celebrity, anybody with those sorts of interests or concerns would like to walk into the gallery and see what's on display there.
Yes, certainly. Mark, did you want to add something to that? Or
Well, I've often thought of Beerbohm as a way of accessing a place, a period, a world, because he caricatured, wrote about, some points corresponded and knew with a great many cultural, political, and other figures in Britain from roughly 1890 to the 1940s. And one may not know Max Beerbohm's work, but a lot of people have heard of the people that he interacted with in some way, either drawing caricatures of them, writing a parody of their fiction or poetry, knowing them in some way. And those famous figures are still household names: Oscar Wilde, Henry James, Thomas Hardy, Aubrey Beardsley,
Virginia Woolf.
Virginia Woolf, Yeats, the list, Shaw, the list goes on and on. And for many years, I worked on a bibliography of Max Beerbohm's work, which became so large and detailed and complicated that my ability to actually understand it basically disappeared. But I knew that people would not be that interested in Beerbohm. There have always been readers and admirers. He once said that he had 1,500 readers in Britain and another 1,000 in the United States. But I thought, if you are interested in that period, the late Victorians, the Edwardians, the Georgians, you might want to look up something in the index. Did Beerbohm caricature, say, Siegfried Sassoon? Did he write a parody of George Meredith? People who, if you were a scholar, you might want to know this. If you were a collector, an enthusiast. So that was, I always have seen Beerbohm as a way of connecting to his time and place.
And of course, Margaret, you touched on this. Beerbohm was a master of deflation. Anything large, whether it be ideals, ideas, literary works, or indeed individuals,
or
and himself. Well, that made him so more endearing, that he had this self-effacing quality to him. So we'll talk about all of that. It's very interesting. But first, before we really delve into the subject matter of the exhibition, I want my audience to get to know you a little better. So each of you, maybe you could tell me how you came to love art, and Victorian art in particular, because you've been collaborating together on many successful projects in this field.
Yes, for, oh goodness, well over 40 years, beginning with an exhibition.
I was almost going to say,
Yep, Mark, you froze. This froze. Yes, for over 40 years, we began with an exhibition.
Forever, really.
Called England in the 1880s. That was our first Mark, for some reason.
And I mean, I had the, not even sure, I wouldn't use the word luck, I would say use the word fate, to have grown up in a turn of the century house and to have known a very elderly woman who was the last living person to have known Robert Browning, William Morris, and Edward Burne-Jones. Mind you, this is not in London. This is in suburban Connecticut. And so I was already attuned really as a teenager to this period, and I loved everything about the late 19th century.
When we first met in the mid 1970s, Mark was already a collector of Raphaelites and a scholar of the Raphaelites. I was mad
Oh, wait,
about the
I'm
late.
just going to just wait a moment. I'm going to mute both of you just for a moment. So I think one of you has maybe a tab open, which causes a feedback loop, which means that you can hear one voice twice or even thrice. So if you could both make sure that there are no other internet tabs open, that would be great.
Are we all right now?
So I've unmuted you, Margaret, so you are doing all right.
Okay.
And then I'm going to unmute Mark again.
How's that?
So
Still getting a bit of an echo.
yes, it seems to be your end, Mark. Could you check if there's not a tab
No,
open?
there's nothing. There's nothing open. There's no other things open on the browser.
That's so strange. And we can't see you either.
It is in itself not a problem. What I will do is, whenever Mark stops speaking, I will mute him, like
Yes,
this.
as I always say, technology is not my friend.
Hey, we are poor academics. What can we say? Boomer tech. We have other qualities going for us. Okay.
So anyway,
yes.
what I was saying was Mark, when I met him in 1975, was already a pre-Raphaelite scholar, collector, obsessed with the mid-19th century. I was obsessed with the late 19th century. I had grown up adoring Oscar Wilde. The Oscar Wilde fairy tales were my introduction to that world. The films, watching The Picture of Dorian Gray when it was shown on New York television, The Canterville Ghost. I wept every single time I saw that, and I saw it as many times as I could. So I dragged Mark, kicking and screaming, into the later part of the 19th century, and we sort of blended our interests. I got a little more interested in the pre-Raphaelites. He got a lot more interested in the late 19th century, and we've been doing this now for many, many years.
Yes, those fairy tales by Oscar Wilde are wonderful, aren't they? The Selfish Giant and the is it the Happy Prince, which was my favorite.
Oh, yes.
Very touching, so sad.
Yeah, weeping. How can you read and not weep?
Yes. Now I'll unmute Mark. I'm not sure because I can't see you, Mark. I'm not sure when to unmute you.
Are you? You're not seeing my video at all?
No, we're not seeing your video.
Oh, there's something off here. I'm seeing myself just fine.
Oh.
Hold on. See if I turn it on and off. Let's see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
No.
No.
Nope. And
No, I can't explain it.
and we're getting the echo from your mic. But anyway,
This is it's
We'll-
very unusual.
we'll live with it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand because I'm seeing both of you and hearing you, but I'm not hearing you very well, actually.
Well, let's go.
Yes. So what I will do is each time you've answered a question, Margaret, I will unmute Mark so that he has the opportunity also to answer the questions. Yes. And I mean, you both have had unusual sort of childhoods and adolescence in that sense. Mark, growing up was the architect Bruce Price, who was also the architect of the Tuxedo Park in New York, and you with your very rich literary upbringing. That's extremely interesting. Now, this exhibition was a long time in gestation. In your quest to see Beerbohm treated more seriously, Mark just alluded to this. He wrote a long draft for a bibliography. So So you also told me about the genesis of the title of the exhibition. What were the other titles you considered, I wonder?
Well, as I said, one was Max Beerbohm and the theater. One was Max Beerbohm, Master of Celebrity Caricature. But neither of those seemed to kind of have anything sexy. And we needed something with more of a hook. So I think The Price of Celebrity, because he really did think very hard about what the cost, both literally and figuratively, was of celebrity. Literally, in his case, he could not afford to go on living in London. That was why he moved to Rapallo in 1910. He wanted desperately to give up his day job, so to speak, although it was really his night job, as reviewer for the Saturday Review of the London theaters. He found it draining to be spending all of his time at the theater, and he found it very constraining to have deadlines and to have to write reviews to deadlines, when really what he wanted was to write at his own pace, write what he wanted. But if he did that, he did not have sufficient income to live the high life of celebrity London. And Rapallo was a lot cheaper. And he convinced Florence Kahn, whom he married, to go there with him and to live a life. I won't call it, precisely a hermit's life, because Rapallo was a place where a number of his British friends sometimes summered or came to visit him, but it was certainly a much quieter, less celebrity-driven life that often consisted of waking up in the morning, having a leisurely breakfast, walking down to the town center, to the cafe, having a coffee, and strolling back. That was the day's activity. Very different from having to take people out for elaborate dinners in London when they had hosted him, and to keep carriages going back and forth to the theater. So, there were lots of reasons why it was easier and cheaper. But that was the literal price of celebrity. The figurative price of celebrity had to do with what it took out of an artist's vision, what it required to think in terms of what was popular rather than what an artist might actually want to be doing. And he made fun of people whom he saw as sellouts. He thought Kipling, in particular, was a sellout to popularity. But this was a subject that turned round and around in his head. And I'll turn this over to Mark now, and I'll show. You want to unmute?
Okay, Mark. If you unmute, I can't unmute you. You have unmuted. You've muted yourself. So, if you could press the microphone button. Yes.
All right. Max had a rather ambiguous relationship with his own celebrity, because he was known from his first published works in the Yellow Book magazine in 1894, and he was an extremely prolific caricaturist, so that with his work appearing in periodicals, a series of books, so that by the time he went to Italy, he was really something of a celebrity himself. And he had this, he, in a sense, he wanted to be famous, but he was aware of the dangers. And as you said, he's constantly deflating his own, particular abilities and activities. Late in life, he was very proud of showing off a publisher's statement from one of his American publishers, which showed, perhaps a 6-month period in which no copies of his books were sold at all. And that was the kind of thing that he enjoyed. Though, as Margaret said, he also needed to make a living. And that living came from the royalties from his publications, being paid to write essays, and he would create a number of caricatures, and every few years these would be exhibited in London and sold. Um, Interestingly enough, the purchasers were quite often the subjects of the caricatures. So they were, those celebrities being celebrated by Max Beerbohm were purchasing their own images. And in one case, George Bernard Shaw's wife, Charlotte, apparently bought one of the very wicked caricatures Max had made simply to destroy it, to remove the image of her husband from the world.
Yes, and if you want to mute Mark,
Margaret, if you could mute and unmute yourself whenever you wish, that might be easier for you.
Okay.
can you mute for a minute?
Oh, this is really difficult.
Otherwise, I'll do it.
Yeah, that's it. You've done it. And in one case, long after the death of Edward VII, Beerbohm went on caricaturing in very nasty ways Edward VII. When his caricatures were displayed as part of one of his exhibitions, there was an uproar in the press, and people felt that this was very unpatriotic and anti-monarchical to have these caricatures, nasty caricatures of the late king. So they were withdrawn from exhibition, but they were also bought by the royal family. Now, some people would say that they bought them to hide them and to make sure that nobody would see these really very unflattering caricatures that made him look like a really awful piece of work, morally and otherwise. Others might say that they bought them because they thought they were hilarious too, and were going to enjoy them privately. Because, that's the thing with Max Beerbohm's work. Even at his most vicious, he is so entertaining. Those Kipling caricatures, that was a lifelong compulsion, it seemed, and he was well aware that this was a compulsion. He once wrote to a friend, "I don't know why I can't stop making fun of Kipling. I know it's terrible of me, but I can't stop." And he drew Kipling in every kind of horrible way as a sort of dwarf-like figure with a huge, rather primitive man jaw, bottle eyeglasses, stumpy little mutant, on and on and on. But there's
and of course carrying a bag of money in his hand.
Carrying a bag of money, yes.
When he won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Yes, this is the business about selling out. But yeah, even if you love Kipling's work, it's impossible not to be charmed by how funny and inventive these caricatures are.
I totally agree, of course. Of course, Richard Kipling, he was an imperialist, and he seemed to write for a large market, which a spiritual aristocrat like Max Beerbohm must have felt some disdain for.
Yes, it was that and this hyper masculinity that so distressed Beerbohm. Anytime anybody was a kind of bullying macho character, one of the items that unfortunately we were told there was not room for in the New York Public Library's exhibition, because the designers had a very clear idea of how things should be done and what there would be room for, was a truly horrifying caricature of President Theodore Roosevelt. Beerbohm thought that Roosevelt really encapsulated everything that he loathed and disdained. The Roosevelt of the Rough Riders of the Spanish-American War, not just the imperialist, the colonialist, but this big figure who rode a horse and shot animals and collected all of these skins and specimens and horned heads, which you can see in his house in Sagamore Hill, Roosevelt's house. All of that offended Beerbohm's sensibility tremendously. And this came through in the caricature that unfortunately we could not show. But yes, it was this emphasis on a very stereotyped kind of masculinity, because Beerbohm, whatever his actual sexuality was, and no one knows precisely what that was, and whether he had sex with anybody and who, we don't know. But whatever the sexuality, his sense of gender, his sense of being a gendered person in the world was extremely fluid, and we might say a little queer.
Yes, but there might have been a sort of cowardly side to Beerbohm as well, in the sense that he did dare to attack viciously Rudyard Kipling in his sort of mocking portrayals of him. But of course, Kipling had a softer side to him as well, which is like told in stories like My Boy Jack, when he lost his son during the First World War. Whereas with the Marquis of Queensberry, his caricature of him is surprisingly mild, because Queensberry was actually someone who would retaliate.
Well, yes, and in part, I think that's because of the venue, because this was a caricature of Queensberry that was going to be published. This was also before Queensberry wrote his infamous note to Oscar Wilde posing some Dumite.
Yes.
Oh, what an idiot he was. But yeah, I mean, and what upset Beerbohm about Kipling was that he also recognized Kipling's talent. He thought he was a marvelous poet who had, again, sold out his gifts as a poet, and a lovely fantasist who had sold out those gifts to write these things about empire that struck Beerbohm as politics gone mad. Beerbohm was not keen on anyone writing politically. He was friends with George Bernard Shaw, but he did not agree with Shaw that politics belonged in the world of the theater. He was a very, very opinionated figure, was Beerbohm, when it came to things like what constituted art and what made art inartistic. And I'll shut up again. And Mark, if you'd like to turn on your microphone.
Oops.
You're still muted. Mark, can you unmute? Yes. Good.
All right, that's it. One has to remember that, Max is, in a sense, when his growing up was in the midst of the decadent 1890s. And though one might not call Beerbohm a decadent writer, especially since he was making fun of it in decadence in a defense of cosmetics, one of his first published articles, he was very much interested in the idea of beauty and art for art's sake, and that literature was not political. It did not have a social message. It was to be enjoyed for its own sake. And the fact that he parodied writers that he tended to admire, and that included Kipling. And he wrote a number of parodies of Kipling. Though he hated Kipling's views, he said Kipling was a genius and had misused that genius for political purposes. Beerbohm was also a little bit of a prophet. Interestingly enough, there's a caricature, a drawing from the 1920s when he did do what you must call one must call social commentary about some of it is anti-labor, some of it is anti-aristocracy, anti-royalty, but he drew a very interesting caricature that seems to predict not only a future world war, but a weapon, warning the world of a weapon of such mass destruction that you almost think that Max was prophesizing the atomic bomb. It's quite something, and extremely unexpected for someone whose, métier was caricaturing writers and artists and people from the theater.
Yeah, that did not make it into the show.
No, it's an unusual side of Max's work, and in my view, the what I call the social commentary drawings are not, they're not as funny, they're not as amusing, but something set him off after the First World War, and he did a number of these, and but there aren't very many of them. He did do early on a group of caricatures called The Second Childhood of John Bull. Largely, these are attacks on Rudyard Kipling, but it's also an attack on imperialism. This was not a success, either critically or financially. The caricatures reproduced in a gargantuan-sized album from a publisher who soon went bust.
And I'm going to bring over something. Mark, mute yourself, please. We're getting the echo. I'm going to bring over something that I've got on the cushion behind me.
Well, can you show again? That is fantastic. So that is a self-portrait, right, of Max Beerbohm.
This is not a self-portrait.
No.
But this is, I'll explain it. This is a caricature of Max Beerbohm that was done by a British artist who worked at Punch for many years, Herbert Thomas, known as Bert Thomas. And it's called Count Max of Rapallo. And it is Max Beerbohm as a Don Quixote, or Don Quixote, you choose your own pronunciation, figure, who has as his lance a gigantic pen that is dripping ink, and who has a palette in his hand. And on his horse, there is a big sort of rosette that says Rossetti and his circle, with a caricature of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But it's a reminder that Max Beerbohm was, in a sense, somebody who went tilting at windmills. He was very, as I say, opinionated. He had his own views, his social views. They were often socially conservative. The brilliant critic Alex Murray has just published a new book on decadent conservatism, and Max Beerbohm certainly fits in decadent conservatism. So yes, his contemporaries recognized the fact that, as well as being a comic writer, he was also somebody with his own kind of axes to grind, or in this case, his own kind of lance to stick into people. And it may not always have been the popular view of things. In fact, often his was an unpopular view. I'm done.
Okay. Yes, you touch on, you both touched on art for art's sake and for different readings of Beerbohm. Of course, something that's interesting, and you touch on this in the exhibition labels that you wrote for the exhibition, which are excellent. They are full of information, but they are still concise and readable. So that's quite rare. And they are also accessible online, which is fantastic for someone like me who lives in England and I can't go to New York on a whim. So that's great. You also touch on his relationship to women, because what you do notice is that, of course, he was an upper middle class white man, and he would usually mock other upper middle class white men. There are few people of color. There are almost no women when there were a lot of female writers, female artists, and so forth. So could you maybe explore this a little bit?
Whoa, this is a touchy subject. Yes, indeed. There's a marvelous essay by Beerbohm from 1920 that we did not reference in the exhibition called The Crime. And it's very funny, and it's also very disturbing. It has him as the protagonist, renting the equivalent of an Airbnb, a little cottage from someone that he knew. And while he's there, looking at the shelf of books sitting in front of him, and finding among them a book by a woman writer, or as he usually put this, a literary lady or authoress. Those were his usual terms, and they were not meant to be complimentary. And he recalls having met this woman. When he looks at the book, which he hasn't read, there are little blurbs from reviews saying, in extreme vitality, her vitality stands out. And he remembers thinking, oh, yes, she was certainly filled with vitality, and she was a bit much for him. And then he goes into a little digression about how he knows maybe you, the reader, don't agree, but it always seems to him wrong that women would be professional authoresses, that they would have agents and keep turning out books and doing all sorts of things like that. That's not his view of what women should be doing, certainly not ladies. The upshot of this in the essay called The Crime is that he takes the book, he puts it in the fireplace, and he lets it burn. And he feels a kind of satisfaction until he realizes that it's not burning all the way. And he keeps trying to destroy this book, which doesn't ought to be consumed. And in the end, he kind of gives up. And it's a moment of quite literal, as well as figurative, I think, impotence, when he cannot destroy this very vital woman writer's work. And that essay says a lot about Beerbohm's attitude toward women. He did not feel comfortable caricaturing living women for public display of the caricatures. He thought that was ungentlemanly. But on the other hand, in private, or when he was writing about women writers in general and not going after a particular one, boy, could he be horrible. Mark, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, he felt that it was improper to create caricatures of living women. There are a few exceptions, one of which is in the exhibition. Actually, it's Sarah Bernhardt, who appears in a caricature of Edmond Rostand, the author of Cyrano de Bergerac. And in this case, Bernhardt is caricatured in male dress.
In Lilon.
And then there are a few other caricatures of women who are on the stage, but we're talking about a handful. There are very few caricatures of men of color. There's one which is not particularly nasty, of the boxer Jack Johnson, and in a caricature that is of Joseph Conrad, Conrad is seen entering a room full of ship captains. And one of them, of course, is from Conrad's 1897 novel, The Nigger of the Narcissus. And that was something we did not include in the exhibition. But Beerbohm, those are really exceptions. Um, the, the subjects that Beerbohm caricatured were, virtually all male, all white, all of a certain stature in British and to some extent American and European political, literary, cultural circles.
Yes, he tended to go after people with power and the power of celebrity.
You should be good to speak, Margaret.
Sorry?
So what did you say? Could you repeat that? Because there was a echo.
Okay, I said, yes, he tended to go after people with power and, of course, the power of celebrity.
Yes, now, so when he said that he didn't caricature women because he thought it would be cruel and ungentlemanly, should we maybe, to play the devil's advocate, take his word for it? Because if you look at his, his friend Aubrey Beardsley, who was just like born three days before him, and they reached their pinnacle of fame around the same time in the mid 1890s. He, of course, he did depict a lot of women, but most of them were very unflattering, very sexual, often a bit sort of denigrating depictions of women. Beerbohm didn't do that, so he clearly did have a very different instinct than Beardsley.
I wouldn't call it just an instinct. I would say he had a certain aesthetic. And it was an aesthetic that ruled both his artwork and his life. And by his artwork, I mean his visual art and also his writing. But it was an aesthetic that came from his love and admiration for the world of the dandy. Max Beerbohm was obsessed with the past. He became obsessed with his own past as he got older. But certainly when he was young, he was obsessed with the early 19th century, with the period of the Regency, with the dandies. And what struck him about the dandy and about the dandy's philosophy of dress, which Beerbohm saw as a philosophy of life as well, was the notion of restraint. Restraint, holding back, renunciation, clearing away, simplicity, and self-control. When we think about his quite vicious caricatures in general, and in particular of figures whom he loved and adored, like Oscar Wilde, what he went after was what he saw as the absence of self-control. So yes, when he chose not to caricature living women, this was a matter of choice, control, stopping himself from doing the kinds of things that Beardsley indulged in when it came to drawing. But also this was the, oops, my image has frozen. If you can still hear me, I'll go on talking. This was also how he worked in his writing and his visual art. Everything was about control and making fun of those who did not see the need for self-control. He was anti-Freudian. When Freud turned up in England, when Freud's ideas began to circulate around 1910, which was precisely when Beerbohm was leaving England, which is interesting in itself, Beerbohm was not at all on board with Freudian psychology. Nonetheless, he understood and wrote about, very self-consciously, the idea of compulsion and the danger of compulsion. which for him was the opposite of the control that the dandies turned into something beautiful. To give way to compulsion, to give way to something that drives you, whatever that drive might be, seemed to him the opposite of the practice of art.
Mark, if you want to add anything to that, of course, always feel free to unmute yourself. But in the meantime, I think it's just such a shame that he did not grasp the opportunity to mock people like Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West.
Well, he did. He did mock Virginia Woolf, but only privately. In one of the items in the exhibition, which in fact is part of Mark's collection, he took a copy of her Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Brown and Mr. Bennet, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Brown. I know I'd get that right if I tried on the third try. Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, which had been given to him by a woman friend, Virginia Woolf's essay, that in its Hogarth Press publication has a, what is it, a Mark, is it a frontispiece, is it a cover? Mark? Frontispiece or cover?
Yeah, it's the cover. It's the cover designed by her sister Vanessa Bell.
It has a cover by Vanessa Bell of a figure who's sort of reclining and reading like this, a woman. And Beerbohm did his own caricature of that, showing himself falling asleep while reading Virginia Woolf. So, you know, Virginia Woolf herself never saw this, and he never published it. So it was not making fun of her publicly, but he certainly made fun of her privately.
Yes, as someone who did have the guts to do that was Percy Wyndham Lewis publicly, who in 1930 wrote one of my favorite novels, The Apes of God, which is a satire of London's contemporary literary and artistic scene, in which he ridicules the Morse, the Sitwells, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and so forth. Of course, Percy Wyndham Lewis was a very unpopular figure in the end, but Beerbohm was very much forgiven for all his little mocking of his. He usually mocked people that he knew personally. So how come he got away with it?
Mark, do you want to answer that?
As I mentioned, it was often his victims who purchased the caricatures that Max had done of them. I mean, even the people that he really, made fun of, were pleased. In fact, it almost was a mark of achieving celebrity to be caricatured by Max Beerbohm. And I think it's Edmund Goss who wrote to one of their mutual friends or acquaintances and said something like, "Max has got you, and you may not like it, but it will give your friends great pleasure." Henry James, there's a story that Henry James and Max were at a dinner party following the publication of Max's book of parodies, A Christmas Garland, in 1912. And someone asked James his opinion. And James pointed to Max across the table and said, "You must ask Beerbohm. He is in possession of my innermost thoughts." So Beerbohm was so admired by the people, many of the people anyway, that he did mock. It's quite remarkable. And eventually, of course, the royal family, or certainly the British establishment, forgave him because he received a knighthood. But typical of Max, he never published using his title.
And about how people forgave him and why they forgave him, he was so good at making fun of himself too. It was hard to hate anybody who would turn his satirical gaze in his own direction so beautifully and so often.
Oh, one of my favorite items in the exhibition is item 55. I just laughed out loud when I saw that, which is the Prince of Wales in New York in 1924, where he's being ripped apart by two society hostesses, two socialites, trying to get him. And you explain in the exhibition label that there's a term called lion hunting, which I wasn't familiar with before, which means being in pursuit of celebrities for your own social gatherings. I thought that was such a delightful caricature.
Yes, and in fact, in the first number of the Yellow Book in April 1894, there is a wonderful short story by Henry James called The Death of the Lion, about an author who becomes a celebrity and who goes to a house party where these kind of lion hunting people are so eager to have his latest work that they take his manuscript to read and they lose it, and it's gone forever. And when he dies, it can't be recovered. So yes, this lion hunting was a very British term, and we see Max making fun of Americans doing their own version of lion hunting when Edward VIII was in the US. And yes, I love that caricature too, because the two women, who of course are not actual women, so Beerbohm was not making fun of any living women. They both look like big strapping gals, and they're just pulling at this figure who could just as well have been a wax mannequin, who is sort of inert and frozen, but very good looking, right in between them. And I'll just throw in a plug while I'm here for our dear friend Jane Tippett, who has just published a new book, which everyone should be looking for, about Edward VIII. It is published in the UK, and if you Google Jane Tippett, Tippett, you can read all about the things she's discovered about Edward VIII that nobody else had known about until she came across some unpublished work of his. So if there are any Edward VIII fans out in the audience, go look for Jane Tippett's new book.
I mean, that's very interesting. Of course, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Edward VIII was, of course, only very briefly monarch in Britain, and the people here still have a very great fascination with him because of his affair with Simpson, and of course his little dalliance with Adolf Hitler and everything. Yes.
Oh yeah, and there's no papering over that. But there are other aspects to him that Jane Tippett has written about that certainly don't excuse his I don't know quite what word to use, but his dabbling in relationship with Hitler. But again, there's something more to him than just that. So.
Even more. Everyone, go and buy this book and tell me what's written in it. I'm very curious now. Everyone, go buy this book. Dragon Ash notes. Interestingly, there's a caricature of sorts of the Bronte sisters in a drawing called "Let Justice Be Done." So yes. I believe this one's also in the exhibition, right?
It is. It is. And Mark, are you still there? We don't have you. We don't have you.
I'm back. Yes.
Good. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about that? Let Justice Be Done, because you own it.
Yes, and of course, in the background is Max's version of Bramwell Bronte's portrait of his sisters that's in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and it's a somewhat obscure caricature today because the two men in front are, well, I would say they're beyond being unknown. I mean, even I, as a longtime collector of Max and a kind of passionate follower of every obscure aspect of the British late 19th and early 20th century, had to sort of learn who the two figures are. One of them is a journalist named Clement Shorter, who was the editor of a number of very popular magazines and obsessed himself with the Brontes and wrote about them incessantly. With him is a British man who was the Duke of Bronte, which is some kind of obscure aristocratic title. And the joke is that Clement Shorter is approaching the Duke of Bronte to get Charlotte and Emily made duchesses in retrospect. So it's a kind of obscure caricature, but it's wonderful to think of Max connecting these contemporaries of his with the famous writers of a century before.
Yeah, and the Branwell Bronte portrait that we all know is by no means terribly flattering when it comes to how he represents his sisters. So Max Beerbohm doing his own even less flattering version of that portrait really kind of makes it a big joke. But it's a lot of fun. Thank you for mentioning that one.
Yes, thank you, Dragon Ash. So I really want to know, because Mark, you touched on gaining all this insight into what these characters really mean. So could you just please tell me, I'm so curious, how on earth did you collect all these drawings and writings?
It's very simple. I suffer from something called maximania, and it's a disease that others have caught over the years. What is quite interesting is that the major collectors of Max's work have all been Americans except one, the writer Philip Guadala, and they've all basically either lived in or grown up near New York City. So that the great collections that are now in American institutions of Max's work at Princeton, at UCLA, at Harvard, and I should say now at Delaware. I started, once I knew who Max was, with the thought that it would be good to have a representative original caricature in a collection of late 19th and early 20th century British literature and art. In 1981, I purchased the caricature of the writer Frank Harris and Shakespeare called Had Shakespeare Asked Me. And I thought that was it. But I got so interested in Max's work, and I began to look at the books about him, and there are several bibliographies. And I thought, well, I'm a collector, but I'm also a bibliographer. And my goal was to take those bibliographies and combine the information, add new information, and provide, in a sense, a reference book about Max Beerbohm, but also a kind of guidebook to the entire period because of all of his caricature, the subject of his caricatures, his writings, his essays, and so on. When you have a project like that, you're often quite keen to add material, and that's what happened to me. I had a compulsion, and still have a compulsion, to collect Max Beerbohm, to the point where you'll see in the exhibition, there's a box of his cigarettes and his matches, and one of his walking sticks. And if I ever saw anything else that belonged to him, I'd want that too.
And you were encouraged in this by Richard Hart Davis.
Beerbohm's, in a sense, last publisher, and who was also, in a sense, the his literary and art agent in the last years of his life, and then posthumously advising the Beerbohm estate. And I went to visit Rupert Hart Davis in Yorkshire in 1987 and spent 4 or 5 days looking at his massive archive of Mac's materials, some of which is now in my collection. And we recently had the extraordinary opportunity to meet a British writer named David Price Jones and his wife. Price Jones, we believe, is the last living person to have met Max Beerbohm, which he did when he was 16 years old. And he tells a wonderful story of Max offering him the choice of any book from Max's library, many of which Max had improved with caricatures and inscriptions. And Price Jones was young, and he didn't accept a book as a gift.
What else would you say?
I'll just mute the mic. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Good, good. That is so interesting. And so this was the last person. Max's life was just so fascinating. He was born in August 1872, and then he knew all these figures like Oscar Wilde. But then he also still lived at the time when Elvis Presley just released his Heartbreak Hotel. What kind of life is that? I mean,
I don't think he gave a damn about Elvis Presley. No, I mean, I can't quite picture Max Beerbohm listening to 1950s rock and roll. Now, it's true that he lived on, but he was not very keen on lots of things about modern life, and he loved to tell people that he was not keen on modern life. He liked to present himself as a figure of the past. Of course, he'd been presenting himself as a figure of the past from the time he was in his early 20s. It was part of his persona. But I think as he got older, he really grew into that role that was almost a joke when it began. And that was part of his charm. This was part of his second life of celebrity when he, in the 1930s and 1940s, was doing broadcasts for the BBC, for the radio, because those broadcasts were often focused on his memories of London of the past, things like the music halls or the various sorts of attractions in London, politicians, things he had seen when he was much younger. And as he got older, I think he felt less and less attached to all sorts of things in modern life. Being in Rapallo, being in a sort of different world allowed him a sort of distance from the new generations, from the new art, from a lot of new things, so that he could just scoff from a great distance at all the things we were doing in America, like creating the music of the future. That wasn't his interest.
yes, and you touch on this sort of deliberate shaping of his own persona. And in item 48, for example, which is an undated notes for a projected essay, he sort of writes or copies passages from a Henry James story, which apparently really speak to him. To what extent was he really an authentic person, and to what extent did he shape himself? And did he really remain a constant, like throughout all those years of activity, did he remain constant in all his views, or did he actually mature or mellow or change as he grew older?
Oh, that's a fascinating subject. I think the idea of authenticity did not appeal to him. Artifice did. In the labels, I was the one who wrote the labels, and in the labels, I talk about him as a figure of camp. in the Susan Sontag sense of a deliberate choice of artifice and outrageousness. And that was for him more interesting than authenticity. What he stayed true to, I think, was this philosophy of what I associate with dandyism and what I think he associated with dandyism, which is this renunciation, this putting off of excess and extravagant things that were not germane to the simple forms, to the elegant forms, to the beautiful forms. He was always keen on beauty as he defined it, and he was always keen on this notion of control and self-control. And Mark, do you want to tell the story about, I forget what kind of bird it was that he hadn't seen, that he was being called out to look at?
This took place when Max and his wife Florence Kahn were back in Britain during the Second World War. They left Rapallo for both world wars. Miraculously, their house was unscathed when they returned after the Second World War. So they're living in a cottage in Surrey, and the story is that Florence heard a dove outdoors, and she remembered that Max had never heard a dove, and she told Max, who said, "You must go outside and hear the bird." Well, Max deliberated so long over what to wear on this very special occasion that when he did go outside, the dove had flown away.
But he could never just walk outdoors.
Oh
He
no.
needed to dress before he would go out. You're muted, Cheyenne.
Yes, that's a wonderful anecdote. If you could both go back in time, because you've been spending so much time with Beerbohm, and you both have a really good idea of what he was like as a person and as an artist. So if you were to go back in time and have a conversation with him, what would that dialogue look like? What kind of questions would you ask him? And how do you think he would have responded?
I would never have gone back to talk to Beerbohm because I know that he would not have wanted to talk to me. Again, this goes back to his dislike of literary ladies, his dislike of women intellectuals. I think I, as a woman academic, would have made him draw back and not give me any interesting answers to anything. And I wouldn't have been keen to talk to him. I can love his work without loving him, and while continuing to be offended by his misogyny and sexism. I'm a great lover of the work of Rebecca West, Dame Rebecca West, and she has a marvelous essay in her 1931 book, collection of essays called Ending in Earnest, in which she talks about having met Max Beerbohm at a dinner party where he was just horrible. He kept treating her as though she were somehow exceptional, but nonetheless confessing to her, as he pointed to all of the other women authors there, that he did not like literary ladies. And it was this nasty sort of thing that you sometimes see with male academics as well as male intellectuals, where they will treat a woman as the exception or almost have a sort of pet woman. And he was treating her on this occasion as the pet woman that he could confide in about how much he really felt uncomfortable with all of these other literary and intellectual women. So no, I would not go back and meet him. I want to go back and meet Oscar Wilde. Thank you. Mark?
Well, he probably would have put up with me, though he was not particularly fond of collectors of his work. He had bits of correspondence with some of them, but he wasn't usually very helpful to them. In some cases, he had fun with them. The collector, the biographer of Baron Corvo, A.J.A. Simmons, was compiling in the 1930s an elaborate bibliography of the writers of the 1890s. And he would write to the survivors of that period with all kinds of questions about their work. You know, when did they write something? When was it published? And so on. He wrote to Max with various questions, which Max did not answer. He said, I don't remember, you know. I mean, even if he did remember, he wasn't going to answer. And then Max spent a good part of the letter describing a very rare pamphlet that he had written in the early 1890s in detail, the circumstances of writing it, that he was staying at a country house, and this was a little, you know, joke about one of his hosts, and you know how it was printed and circulated. And then he says, but you know, I just can't tell you anymore because I can't find my copy. He had, of course, invented this pamphlet to drive the collector crazy. Now, I would have a little bit of an in with Max, because I am very likely, very distantly related to Florence Kahn. So I might have been able to pull that on him. He was, you know, welcoming to visitors, if male visitors, and sometimes women, but if they had a stature, you know, an accomplishment of their own in the theater, or as writers or artists. And when you ask what would I query Max about, well, it's been done, and no one would need to do it again, because S.N. Behrman, the American dramatist, who had discovered Max when he was a teenager in the Worcester, Massachusetts library, wrote to Max and visited him several times in the 1950s. And he created what was first a series of articles in the New Yorker, which one of these is shown in the exhibition, that were collected into a book called Portrait of Max, or Conversation with Max, published in 1960. And how he recalled Max's conversation is something of a mystery. His papers in the New York Public Library have very brief diary entries, but nothing like, you know, the detail that he recalled. But he visited Max multiple times and would get Max to reminisce about the people he had known. So, you know, if you want to know Max's comments about Oscar Wilde, Kipling, the Pre-Raphaelites, or any subject, it's in Behrman's book.
Okay, so you would have to consult that book. That was a very good answer, Margaret. I still feel slightly unsatisfied with yours. Although I do understand the sort of mutual dislike between you. If you could pull off Twelfth Night, so you would disguise yourself as a man, and he would take you seriously. What would you? You know, because there must be sort of open. There must be elements of his life that are not entirely clear, or parts of his life that he didn't speak about, such as his sexuality, maybe aspects of his marriage to Florence. It is not anything you would try to unearth?
No, no, I'm not a biographer. I'm whatever he wanted to keep private, I'm happy to let him keep private. No, I would, if he would allow me to show up in my vile costume in 12th Night, I would just do what I think David Price Jones did, except, I just show up and be a fan and just tell him how wonderful I thought his work was, and hope that he would allow me to choose a book from his library in Rapallo. And unlike David Price Jones, I would definitely walk away with something. But it would be very hard to choose which one. There were all sorts of things that would
Yes, well, that's a good question. So if you could nick anything from Beerbohm's private library or collection, or any caricature or anything, of course, Mark already has a lot of different things from Beerbohm, but if you could choose anything, what would it be? What's your top one favorite?
Gosh. Well, for a very different reason. We had wanted for this exhibition to borrow several items from Merton College, University of Oxford. And for various reasons, the loans did not come through. The loans did not work out. There is, at Merton, a very beautiful little statue of Max done by the artist Kathleen Bruce. And this is a rare instance of a woman artist doing an image of Max Beerbohm. Also a rare instance of a statue of Max Beerbohm. And that's something that I would love to have.
What about you, Mark?
Well, I would love to have that statue as well. Kathleen Bruce was quite friendly with Max, and there's more than a hint of romantic interest. Certainly, there are some correspondence that's a bit flirtatious. Very unusual for Max to admire a woman artist. She married Robert Falcon Scott of the Antarctic. And after his death, she married a banker and collector named Edward Hilton Young, who became Lord Kennet. And several years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the then 92 or 93-year-old Lady Kennet at her home in London, which in fact had been J.M. Barrie's house on Bayswater. And it was the most magnificent house I've ever been in London. And it was filled with the most incredible treasures. Paintings, drawings, books, all kinds of things. So Kathleen Bruce is someone of, great interest to me. And there is a biography by her granddaughter, actually, of her. And some of the correspondence that she had with Max has been published. The thing I would love to find is a caricature that has never been seen. There are no reproductions of the caricature. It is simply listed in one of the exhibitions of Max's work at the Leicester Gallery. And it's called Editing the Yellow Book, Mr. Henry Harland and Mr. Aubrey Beardsley. And I would die to own that. I in my mind's eye, I kind of think I know what it might look like, but of course we don't know.
Okay, those were very interesting and comprehensive answers. Thank you for that. We've got to wrap up in like 10 minutes. So I've skipped some other questions that I had, and I'll go straight to my 7 questions that I ask each guest. and these are my favorites. I do love them so much. The first one is, what is one book that everyone should read? Margaret, please go ahead.
Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre.
Yes, yes. If Mark, yeah, I mean, it's. What about Mark?
I have a really a favorite book by an American illustrator writer named Rosemary Wells, and it's called Voyage to the Bunny Planet, published in 1994, and it's ostensibly a children's book, but in its original form, it's really a book for anybody. And I won't spoil it except to say that it is possibly the most comforting read imaginable.
And there's a nod to Kipling.
Yes, there's on the back of the title pages, there are minute parodies of Ben Franklin, Galileo, and Rudyard Kipling with appropriate vignette illustrations. But it is a absolutely beautiful book in terms of its stories and its illustrations and its physical format. It's in its original publication, it's 3 very small books in a slipcase. And it always makes me think of a Victorian 3-volume novel.
Like Jane Eyre.
Like Jane Eyre.
Who's your favorite artist and why?
Well, this may be a surprise because it is a living artist, and you may not be familiar with her work. The name is Roz, R-O-Z, Chast, C-H-A-S-T. She is a cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine, and she's also done several books. I am a great fan of humor, and especially of women's humor. I think the tradition of Beerbohm as a caricaturist, cartoonist, etc., tends to run through the masculine line, but Roz Chast is absolutely hilarious. I adore her work, so she would be my favorite artist, at least living artist. Mark?
I almost said Max Beerbohm, but no. It has to be James McNeill Whistler. And that's extremely simple to explain. He was famous for wearing a monocle, and so am I. And I love his artwork, and of course he was admired by Max Beerbohm, a strong influence on Max, particularly as a dandy, and a self-created figure of celebrity.
So, what's your favorite painting and why?
It's a fairly obscure one, although less obscure in the States than elsewhere. It is by a woman artist, Cecilia Beaux, B-E-A-U-X. 1893, called Sita and Sarita, which shows a woman with green eyes, black hair, and a white dress that nods to Whistler's White Girl. Perched on her shoulder is a black cat, also with green eyes. And the two of them, she is actually the cousin of Cecilia Beaux. Her name was Sarah, but she's called here Sarita. The cat was Sita. The two of them are in a relationship with one another. And I love the idea of a painting in which a human being and an animal are together, equally important, each having a personality. It's a beautiful double portrait of two characters, neither of them celebrities, but both of them extremely aesthetically presented and fascinating.
Mark?
Ooh. I have to say my favorite painting has got to be Sargent's portrait of Dr. Potsy. He's the most elegant man portrayed at the turn of the century. He has a beard and he's wearing a red dressing gown. And I would like to spend my life wearing his dressing gown.
Mark does have a red dressing gown.
Yeah, it was not as good as his, no. But there was an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2015, and we went to see it. It was a show of Sargent's portraits of writers and artists. In a sense, it was a kind of mirror image of Beerbohm, because Sargent was portraying his friends and a great many celebrities. And then there were other people in it as well. And it was seeing that exhibition and that painting that I decided to grow a beard.
Potsy light.
Right. So, what's your favorite piece? And I'm sorry for just running through these questions, but we've got to be quick. So, what's your favorite piece of architecture?
The Metropolitan Museum of Art, but my favorite part of it no longer exists. When I was a child, because the Metropolitan Museum of Art was what introduced me to the world of art and exhibitions. But what does not exist anymore is their original restaurant, which was around a fountain, and the fountain had sculptures by the Art Deco sculptor Paul Manship. And I absolutely adored that when I was a child.
And was that replaced by something generic or something very modern and sterile? Or?
No, they paved over the fountain to put in more tables to make more money.
Capitalism. Yes. Mark.
My favorite piece of architecture is a room in the Liverpool Central Library called the Hornby Library. And it's an addition put on in the early 20th century to house the collection of books, manuscripts, and artworks of a local collector. And I could just about live in that room. A number of years ago, we did an exhibition of the Liverpool-born poet, friend of Oscar Wilde's, Richard Le Gallienne, in that room. And it's just magnificent. It's not enormous, but it's not small. And it was purposely built so that it is an Edwardian temple holding a late Victorian collector's collection.
Okay. What is a realization that really changed your life or career?
That I could write labels for exhibitions, which is obviously what I've done. You've read my labels for the Beerbohm exhibition, or perhaps some people have also read the ones I wrote for the Beardsley exhibition last year at the Grolier Club. That I could do this without ever having taken a single art history course in my life and been trained solely as a literary scholar. So everything that I do in the world of art and art history is as a dabbler and an amateur.
But maybe that's what makes them so uniquely readable.
Well, that could be it. Thank you.
No vague slang and like lingo, incomprehensible nonsense. No, they are very good. What about you, Mark?
The realization that one can actually acquire books and manuscripts and artworks, which I had thought originally really could only be in museums and libraries. I mean, I can remember seeing, going to exhibitions, but I didn't realize that these were things that you actually could own.
You're muted. Cheyenne, you're muted.
I was just saying thank you. I was just saying now, thanks to you, Mark, many of them have ironically ended up in a public library.
Yes.
Yes. So, what is a quote that you really like?
It's Oscar Wilde, of course. The only excuse for being occasionally overdressed is to be always overeducated.
Wilde was great like that. What about you, Mark? Also Wilde or some more obscure figure?
We'll go to Max for this one, which is from his soul novel Zuleika Dobson. For those who like this sort of thing, this is the sort of thing they like.
Wait, please, I'm a total simpleton. Could you explain that one?
No.
No. No.
I will just have to live with that, I suppose. The final question is, who's the most brilliant or interesting person you've ever met?
Well, of celebrities, probably it was Barry Humphries when he came to our apartment for tea one afternoon. Thanks to Mark, as a fellow collector, they knew each other, and he really was quite a guest. But of non-celebrities, the wonderful late mentor I had when I was an undergraduate at Queens College, City University of New York, Donald Stone, who was not only a brilliant scholar of Victorian literature, but a collector himself, and who donated a number of very important works on paper to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and who, when we both happened to be in London, when I was in grad school, and he was over on a Guggenheim Fellowship, took me to my first art auction at Sotheby's in London. And that was a revelation to me. Working class girl from New York City, he introduced me to a world I had never seen before.
Yes. So when you say Barry Humphries, do you actually mean the actor who played Dame Edna?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Well, how did he end up in your and Mark's circle?
Mark? Mark, unmute.
Max Beerbohm, of course. Barry Humphries was an extraordinarily passionate collector. His library is reputed to be as large as 50,000 volumes, located in several different countries. And he was a very passionate enthusiast for Max Beerbohm's works, and owned a number of fabulous caricatures and manuscripts and other things.
The library is now closing. The library is now.
I don't know, what was that?
Okay, God, we've got 9 questions that have been sent in. It's horrible by all these interested people. Maybe they don't all relate directly to the exhibition. Maybe we can do in a few months' time a follow-up where hopefully our microphone issues and everything have been solved. Because I've been really enjoying chatting with both of you, but there's so much information that you have, so many interesting stories, insights into this most fascinating turn of the century period. And I'm so grateful that both of you came on the show. Are you working on anything currently, and where can my viewers find you?
We may be doing a volume of essays. We've been asked about this by the University of Delaware Press about Max Beerbohm and celebrity. We have no joint exhibitions coming up, but Mark is actually working potentially on a different sort of exhibition. Mark, do you want to come in and just say what the exhibition is that you're working on? Unmute, Mark, unmute.
An exhibition that's been proposed to the Grolier Club for 2027 called Ricketts, Shannon, Oscar Wilde, and Their Friends, Partnerships in Art, Life, and Books, focusing on Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon, who were artists and founders of one of the great British private presses, the Vale Press, in the late 1890s, tracing their careers and their work. And my co-curator will be Paul van Kappeleving, who is the retired head of the special collections at the National Library at The Hague and the leading expert on Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon. And not to worry, Max Beerbohm will be in that exhibition as well.
Amazing. Thank you very much. You've been two wonderful guests. I'm so lucky to have had you on to the show. Hopefully I'll speak to you soon again. In the meantime, is there anything else you wanted to say, Margaret?
Just thank you. Thank you very much for being our host. Thank you.
No, thank you. I want to wish everyone good health and prosperity to everyone watching, and I'll see you next week again. So goodbye.
Bye-bye.